welcome to the Ethical Humanist Society. Am I queued up to start? Okay, well, again, welcome to Ethical Humanist Society, our long and storied organization, our wonderful organization. I'm glad to see you all here this Sunday morning, and we have a nice presentation for you. And as is our beginning, we are going to have a reading. Zay Munn is going to come up to the podium and introduce the reading and give you a reading, and then I'll come back and introduce the speaker.
When They Speak of Our Time by Reggie Gibson, who is the poet laureate of Massachusetts, and I have excerpted verses from his No King speech on October 18th, 2025. When they speak of our time, they will say that this was when morality gluttonously drank of hatred's hemlock, when many mocked as democracy cowered to executive power. They will say a horrible darkness kissed our ears, kissed until we closed our eyes and trembled with fear until we became that darkness we feared. They will say it was a time when English spoken with the wrong accent meant an uncertain fate. But let them also say that this was when we fought against a self-inflicted civic genocide, that something transcendently human in us stood up to resist the Orwellian jackboot. This was the time we struggled against fist and fallacy, and that it was of judges refusing to kangaroo their courts and prove that in America, the law is king. Let them say that this was when our youth saw us gathered here, found truth and hope fluttering madly on their tongues like a caged feathered thing. And because of us, they were unafraid to open their mouths and let it stretch its wings and sing. Oh, let them say this was a time we desperately reached through the malignant maelstrom of electronic chaos, reached through and found others with our own eyes, with our own hands, reaching back.
Thank you, very nice. Ended with let them say that we showed up here today too, and we're going to keep going. That's very excellent. We have the Ethical Humanist Sunday School kids here, and they are now going to leave and do their own activities. So I want to mention something else about the Ethical Humanist Society. We've been here for close to 150 years, and we have a variety of programs. We alternate. This is our usual time on Sunday morning at 10:30 that we meet, and some of the programs are speakers like this morning, and some of them are community days where our group meets together to strengthen our community and do what we can. So now, without further ado, I want to introduce the speaker. I actually going to pull up my phone because that's where I have it. So today, and maybe I should say that I'm Rick Guthman. I didn't start there. I've been a member for about 15 years and have a variety of roles. The moderators, which is what I'm doing now, rotates. We encourage any of you to participate in any way you want, and we want more moderators. And so please let me know, or anyone here know with a name tag. Everyone with the name tags is members. And you can get more information and participate the way you see fit. So today's speaker is Carey Cranston, and we are titling it The American Prophets, Writers, Religion, and Culture. Let me tell you something about Carey. Carey took on the role of president at the American Writers Museum in September of 2016. Prior to that, Carey had been serving for 12 years as president of Fox College, a private career college in Chicago. And prior to that, he was vice president of Hill & Knowlton, a global PR firm where he led digital and web services and several major clients. He also served as director of technology and e-commerce at Kemper Lesnick Communications, a local PR firm in Chicago. Early in his career, Carey taught writing at UIC and DePaul and worked at both the DePaul University Library and Crocs and Bertano's bookstore. Carey earned a BA in English from DePaul University, summa cum laude, and master's in English from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and a master's in library and information science from the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. So please help me welcome Carey to the Luminous area. Thank you.
Thank you all. I think I need to shorten that bio from wherever it came from. And thanks for having me. I have been here once before. I don't know if any of you ever saw that. It was way back kind of the COVID days, and I came to talk about an exhibit we had done called Dark Testament, A Century of Black Writers on Justice. I will take a few slides to just give you an overview of the American Writers Museum so you have a sense of who we are as an institution and what we do. If you've never been, we are downtown on Michigan Avenue, 180 North Michigan, which is the corner of Michigan Avenue and Lake Street. We are on the second floor. It's a small museum, but is packed full of content and interactive exhibits, and it's really a fun place that celebrates the importance of writing in our history and our culture. And so we do that through interactive exhibits and all kinds of touch screens and turntables and things that you engage with, and we have manual typewriters that people get very excited about, especially the kids who just left here. Would love them. We do a lot of programming as well, so we have authors in, we have author talks in our space on a regular basis. These are things, if you're interested, you can look on our website and sign up for email blasts and find out about who's coming. We also sometimes do big events outside. We'll do author programs in partnership with the Chicago Public Library and with other institutions in the city. This was an example of when Sonia Sotomayor had come to town with us, and we did that at the Chicago Public Library. We also have now a biennial festival every other year called the American Writers Festival, and we bring authors from all over the country to talk about writing and their writing, its significance, et cetera. We have a lot of panel discussions. It's an all-day event. It is returning in 2026. We will have another American Writers Festival at the Chicago Public Library Harold Washington Center downtown. There will be 6 stages. Runs from 11 until 5, so there will be probably close to 100 writers there that day, giving panel discussions and other conversations, and it's free and open to the public. So again, check our website, get signed up, find out more about it. If any of you ever like to go downtown and do something different, first Tuesday of most every month, we have what we call Get Lit. And I think it speaks for itself. The picture tells you a little bit about what's happening. It's basically a chance to come to the museum and visit during some structured, fun activities. We often have trivia or performances and other strange things and scavenger hunts going on. There is a drink available, and people have a really fun time. So if you don't get a chance to come visit the museum during regular visiting hours and you want to come for some extra fun, come visit on a Tuesday night for a Get Lit. Just check our website for the next one, which is early February. And their theme is different every month. We have a lot of educational work. I mentioned kids and typewriters. We do a lot in our efforts to engage people. We kind of say that our exhibits celebrate the past, and our programming promotes the present by bringing in authors of today. And all of that work is really meant to inspire the future. We want people to be engaged with writing. We want people to recognize that if you give someone the ability to write, they become an author. And if they're an author, they have authority. So there is a strengthening of people when they have the ability to tell their own narrative and control that narrative. So inspiring kids is a big part of what we do. We have field trip programs for low-income schools. It is free. We can pay for buses for low-income schools to get to us. We have curriculum from from elementary through high school. And we see a lot of college-age classes that come through as well. So that's a big part of what we do. It's a very engaging space, so that gets the kids excited. And like I said, along with that, we have a lot of online resources for educators. We have downloadable materials. We have a national student writing competition. We can do online field trips. A lot of that happened during COVID, but we continue to do it today. So that's kind of who we are as an institution in general. We also then do special exhibits. We have 2 changing galleries, even though it's not a big space, it's crammed full of information. And in those 2 spaces, we explore all kinds of different topics. Examples are a recent exhibit was called Level Up on writing and gaming that looked at video games and role-playing games and the people who write the stories behind them. There's still information about that exhibit up on our website. That exhibit ended, and I'll get to the most current one. We've also had some really interesting, like I mentioned, Dark Testament, A Century of Black Writers on Justice, My America, Immigrant and Refugee Writers Today. We had an exhibit on Bob Dylan and songwriting on Ray Bradbury. So we look at writing in all kinds of ways, and these special exhibits allow us to take very deep dives into different topics. My America was one that was up during COVID. It went up in 2019 near the end. We had gone out and interviewed over 30 American writers with an immigrant background and asked them all 10 questions. And we turned that into a multimedia exhibit, and people could come in and hear different writers talking about things like how being bilingual affects them as a writer, or what does the theme of home mean to them? You know, what does it mean to be an American? And so we heard from all these different voices. And when we do these big exhibits, we call them exhibit initiatives. And what that means is then we build programming around it. So we bring in writers, we bring in academics, we bring in people to talk about that as well. So when we had My America, we had a whole bunch of programming lined up. We got to kick it off a little bit, and then COVID happened. And then we wound up doing a lot of it online. And so this is an example of one of the authors who we interviewed for that exhibit. And when she came and we had class, and they were able to all get a copy of her book. Dark Testament, I mentioned, was an exhibit about Black writers on justice. Looked at a specific period in time from the end of the Civil War through the Civil Rights era, and we examined a number of the most important writers in that period and looked at the themes that connected them, and then how those were still relevant today. This is our first exhibit that's become a traveling exhibit. So physically, it went to Vanderbilt University this year, or last year, and it's coming up. It will be going to the Detroit in next year, and it's also going to a museum in Baltimore. And so we're looking to keep traveling that. So we're a newer institution. We opened in 2017, and we're starting to now take things out and farther beyond, not just online, but taking our physical exhibits on the road. And that brings me to our most recent, newest exhibit, which is called American Prophets, Writers, Religion, and Culture. And it's kind of a scary topic. People always say, don't talk about religion, don't talk about politics. Well, we tend to talk about those things anyway. And there was an opportunity to pursue this, and it allowed us to do it in a very in-depth way. There was a grant available to us from the Lilly Endowment that said they wanted people to explore this topic in relationship to who they were as an institution. And we're a unique institution. There's not an American Writers Museum anywhere else in the country. So we had to think about how we would approach that if we wanted to, and why. And so the first thing, you start to ask yourself is, well, where are we as a country in relationship to the concept of religion? How prevalent is it? How much is it invested in what we think about, in what people write about, and how we engage with written content in the world? And there has been, the Pew Research study comes out in depth every 10 years and follows up. And they have been tracking the idea of Americans' belief in religion or alignment with a religion, and it has been in decline. And people have known that, and though actually it did level off in the last one. It didn't keep going down, but it has dropped precipitously. So something that maybe 30 or 40 years ago, if you asked people if they had a religion they were affiliated with in America, probably close to 90% would have said yes. And now that number is down to 62, 63%. So that has been a precipitous drop. Most of that has been in Christian faiths. There has been growth from 5 to 7% for people of other faiths, but the main growth is in people who are religiously unaffiliated. So on the surface, you tend to see a movement away from religion and a movement to being unaffiliated. But there was also something in that same survey, which is a very in-depth survey, that we found kind of interesting, which is they ask 4 questions. Do you believe you have a soul or a spirit in addition to your physical body? Is there a God or a universal spirit? Is there something beyond the natural world? Is there an afterlife? And you can see those are 86, 83, 79, 70%, so bigger than that 62%. And as a net, people who believe one or more of those four things, that's 92% of Americans. So it brings up the notion that religious affiliation is not necessarily tied to the idea of spirituality or belief in things beyond the physical world. And so that means that when we talk about what's going on and what people are writing about, it is inevitably influenced by these forces, either what they believe or were raised to believe, what the people around them believe. So our writers are heavily influenced by religion. And because of that, they are also then influencing how people think about the spiritual, religion, belief, how we put our morals together, how we think about the world, and how we relate to it. And so that really made us want to explore this in more detail. And as we were working on this, we could have gone one of two ways. We could have decided on a very specific tract and said, well, let's focus on a particular type of writing or a particular era or a certain group and be very focused. But we decided to go the reverse. And we said, how broad of a topic is this? How often are we seeing this in the world that we live in? And that led us down a bunch of different roads. And so I want to address the idea of why we call the exhibit American Prophets first. As people ask, what, are you equating these people with prophets? Are the writers the prophets? And to some extent, we are saying they are prophets, but with a lowercase p. And there are many definitions of the word prophet, and a lot of it has to do with influencing how people think. And so Isaac Bashevis Singer is a very famous Jewish writer who received the Nobel for Literature in 1978, and he had said, in their despair, a number of those who no longer have confidence in the leadership of our society look up to the writer, the master of words. They hope against hope that the man of talent and sensitivity can perhaps rescue civilization, and that maybe there's a spark of the prophet in the artist after all. He said, I'm not ashamed to admit that I belong to those who fantasize that literature is capable of bringing new horizons, new perspectives, philosophical, religious, aesthetical, and even social. In the history of old Jewish literature, there was never any basic difference between the poet and the prophet. So that's kind of where we came to terms with that idea of what we were calling the exhibit. And then we approached it, as I mentioned, with a big initiative like this. We have programming and we have an exhibit. We actually started our programming way ahead of the exhibit opening back in April of last year. And we have held a number of programs across last year. We opened with a big program at the Chicago Public Library with some of the biggest names in science fiction called Making New Gods. We brought in Nnedi Okorafor and Kay Jemison, others, to talk about how they think about other worlds and the religions that might be a part of those worlds, and how they're also then tied to the religious backgrounds or upbringings of those writers. And so that was a very interesting conversation. We also talked to Dave Barry, who's a very famous comedy writer you may be familiar with. You may not think of as religious. He's really not someone who's a religious-based writer, but was raised by a minister. His father was a minister, and it was a big part of his childhood and his upbringing, and something he was reacting to in his comedy and other aspects of his life. We've had academics like Paul Ely. We did a really fun program at the Studebaker Theater with Peter Sagal and 3 other comedy writers. So we had a Jew, a Hindu, a Catholic, and a Muslim up on stage talking about writing comedy and religion and how their beliefs intersect or don't intersect with what they are talking about. We've talked about romance writing. We've talked about other specific writers like James Baldwin. We had a panel at the University of Chicago on horror writing and religion. We've talked about Native Americans, songwriting and spirituality, and a host of others. And we have more programs coming up. All the programs that we've had have been recorded. They are on our YouTube channel. So all of our programming is on our YouTube channel. So there's hundreds of videos up there, but if you're interested in this topic, they're all in a playlist and you can find them on our YouTube channel. So it's been a great way for us to, in advance of the exhibit opening, get people thinking about and talking about the topic, and it also allowed us to gather even more information while we were working on this. Because all of those various different elements that we were talking about in those programs, from horror writing and science fiction to comedy, are things that are a part of the exhibit itself. Some upcoming programs, we've got Marian Ahern, a famous Chicago journalist, who's going to talk about religion and journalism in Chicago. We have some online-only programs in January as well, because it's January and people don't come out. So we've got one on religion and rhetoric and early women's rights on January 27th. We have a book called The Fire Inside about James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, called The Dharma of Baldwin and Lorde. So that one looks really interesting. In March, we have a really interesting program called Assembling Religion, about Henry Ford and religion and how those two things intersected in his intentions for the world. So these are just some of the programs coming up. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever been to the American Writers Museum. This is a map. I don't think it really helps for any purpose other than to say we have two small spaces, the exhibit gallery and the writer's room, that we often change over for these exhibits. But we actually, with this exhibit, went beyond that. We used all the capacity of the exhibit gallery, the writer's room, and some of our readers' halls, some of the children's gallery. We actually spread a lot of the content around for this one as well. And so, what's in this exhibit? Why do people find it interesting? Why might you want to come visit? It's a really, there's a really fun video when you come up. It's an animated film that kind of talks through some of these topics I've been talking to you about, where we look at the writers as prophets as motorcycle gang. Kind of hard to explain, but it kind of lets people set the tone for what we're talking about, and this idea that there are so many different ways that religion and religious beliefs intersect with what people think and believe and inevitably come out of our writers. It might come out of them in the sense of shaping what they write and how they think about the world. It may also be very much about the journeys that they take either toward understanding or belief in something or away from. And so we aren't just obviously looking at people of great faith, we're often looking at people very often who are struggling with the idea of faith or moving away from it or looking at different ways to embrace their understanding of the world. So the exhibit is jam-packed. It doesn't normally look like that. That was from the opening. But the main gallery is broken basically into two sides. Left-hand side, as I mentioned, we're an interactive museum, so we're not a collecting institution. But for special exhibits, we will sometimes either have artifacts created by artists and other people, or we will borrow pieces. And for this, we borrowed a number of really interesting pieces. And they align on the left wall, and then they're also spread out in Reader's Hall. So there are a number of these different artifacts. And the right-hand side are these different bays of interactivity, things that look at the idea of the notion of the theme of journey that I was talking about, embraced in memoirs and novels and things that people expect. But then we also look at songwriting, at comedy, at science fiction, and at poetry. So there are different ways that we dive into it in greater detail. Some of the artifacts, and I'll just talk about three real quick because they're three very different examples. And when people think of an artifact, especially related to literature, and this is why we don't actually have lots of artifacts, is, well, what is it? Is it a typewriter, a pen and inkwell? Is it the first edition book? And there are libraries for first edition books. We're not a library. But the story we wanted to tell was, what is a physical object that holds deep weight for a writer that has some bearing on not just their religious upbringing or their personal religious beliefs, but also then maybe reflected in their work? So three very different examples. Samira Ahmed is a Chicago-based writer. She teaches at the University of Chicago. She writes primarily young adult fiction. And she is Muslim, and she gave us this amulet, and I know you can't see it because it's really tiny up there in that picture. But it's a beautiful metal amulet inscribed, and inside of it is a piece of paper that you can't get out, but written on that piece of paper is a Muslim prayer of protection. Her grandmother gave her that amulet. She's worn it most of her life. It is currently in the museum. It is also something that she worked into the the stories that she tells in her best-selling young adult fiction. So we can see how these things move through time and through generations and are retold and learned about again. Another example, Louis Perez is a friend of the museum. If you know the band Los Lobos, the rock and roll band that still rock and rolls today at 73. Not the band, the members are 73. The band's about 50 years old. But Louis is a founding member of the band and the lyricist. So the lyrics to all of their original songs are written by Louis. And he wrote one song on their album Kiku, which was in the 1980s a best-selling album and a Grammy nominee, I think. And the song is called The Saint Behind the Glass. And in Mexican-American culture, in Mexican culture, the Santo Niño de Atocha is a small shrine-like object that can be found in a home on a dresser or on the mantle, and people put things inside of it that's personal and connected to them and their family. So this particular Santo Niño de Atocha was in the one-room house in East LA where Louis grew up. It was his mother's. It sat on her dresser. It had belonged to her mother in Mexico. And it lives normally in Louis' house in Los Angeles. And so he has loaned it to us as that point of connection. So if you look at this Santo Niño de Atocha, you can see his father's business card, you can see little scraps of money, other things that were important to the family over time for this object that has huge personal connection within the family and connects them back to belief systems that, whether or not Louis is aligned with them in the sense of traditional Catholicism, aren't as important as the fact that it continues to thread its way into our culture. Rachel Pollack is probably not a name many of you are familiar with. Rachel Pollack was a science fiction writer, was most known for, award-winning science fiction writer, comic book writer. Most famous thing she wrote was, or she didn't create, but wrote a new version of something called Doom Patrol. HBO turned that into a mini or a series on HBO for a while, and it's a very odd and eclectic group of people and things that are part of the Doom Patrol, and it really talks about the idea of humanity and what is human and that kind of thing. But Rachel is a very interesting person because, along with all of her other writing, Rachel became very invested in ideas of understanding the goddess myths and also in the tarot. So she was Jewish, was raised Jewish, and continued to believe in a lot of her Jewish faith, while at the same time exploring ideas of mysticism, the tarot, and other topics. So her wife loaned us both Shabbat candles that belonged to her and a statue of the goddess Persephone that belonged to her and was important to her. So, and interestingly, she was so invested in the tarot, she became a very well-known reader and wrote her own book on how to read the tarot and created her own tarot deck. So what's really interesting, and so, you know, other writers, people you might expect, Flannery O'Connor, yes, we have her rosary and holy water bottle. So you have those writers where their religion is a huge part of who they were. You know, she went to Mass every day. But then you also have these very complex ideas. So these artifacts are meant to evoke in people that feeling of, wow, I see where this continues to be a thread. I can see how this continues to affect how people think about the world. And then, like I mentioned, we have these different bays. So one of the bays looks like a little diner booth, has a little jukebox. The jukebox actually works. The menu has a list of songs that are in the jukebox, and the songs range from Chance the Rapper to Carole King and Aretha Franklin, and it looks at, and Kurt Cobain, and it looks at particular songs where you can see some religious tie to the background of the songwriter and what's coming out in the song. So an interesting example of something in there is the song You Have a Friend by Carole King. You probably know some of the lyrics. When you're down and troubled, I should not sing. And nothing is going right. Close your eyes and think of me, and soon I will be there to brighten up even your darkest night. You just call out my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running. So, very famous song. It was also covered by a lot of different people. Interestingly, this is where the readers and the writers interact in a way that we don't always think about. because Carol King was Jewish, but most of her writing was very secular. She was not focused on her faith and talked about this in her work so much. But Aretha Franklin covered this song on her album Medley in 1970, say 2 or 7, no, I can't remember. But in that, she made it a medley with a gospel hymn. And the interpretation of the friend suddenly becomes very religious. You Have a Friend in Me is no longer about my friend, it's about a higher power. It's about a divine connection. And so this is where we also see the fact that readers are going to interpret things based on where they come from. And we see that again in a really interesting way in another one of the bays is an interactive screen that lets people dig deep in through a lot of different clips and other pieces on the idea of comedy, as I mentioned. So there are movies, TV shows, stand-up specials, sketches. They're all on this big touch screen, and it lets people kind of just dig in and think about, oh, the show The Good Place. I think some of us may have watched that show that talks about ethics and morality and where do those things come from and the idea of an afterlife or divine power. And then movies like Oh God, for those of us who are my age, might remember George Burns playing God. And a lot of different things. And so on that screen is also a clip about the movie Groundhog Day. And some of you may have seen the movie Groundhog Day. How many of you have seen the movie Groundhog Day? All right, we've seen it. I'm curious how many of you think about it as a Buddhist-based film. One person. So one of the artifacts that we have is actually Harold Ramis was raised in this area and was Jewish by faith or by being raised, but he was also very interested in Buddhism, so much so that he actually created a little fold-over piece of 8.5 by 11 paper where he typed up the general tenets of Buddhism as he thought of them and called it the 5-Minute Buddhist. And then he would laminate them and he would give them to friends. So in the glass case there is a copy of one that was loaned to us by someone who had received one, signed by him on the back. And he would give these to people. So basically, Groundhog Day as a movie was something that was written by an original screenwriter who did have Buddhist beliefs. And then Harold rewrote the script and made the movie. And so knowing his background, knowing the original screenwriter's background, there was a strong reaction to the film from a lot of different groups. And we can actually hear from Harold himself.
It's a metaphor for a lot of things, which was brought home to me when the movie opened. My producing partner, Trevor Albert, called me on Sunday. The movie opened on a Friday. On Sunday, he called me and said, there are pickets outside the theater in Santa Monica. And I said, what are they protesting? He said, they're not protesting. They're Hasidic Jews walking around with signs that say, are you living the same day over and over again? And then, call the Chabad, I guess. So then I started getting, almost immediately, my mother-in-law lived for 35 years in a Zen Buddhist meditation center to the end of her life. And I called her right away on the weekend, and she said, they saw it. The abbots and the senior monks, she said they loved it. They thought it expresses a fundamental Buddhist concept. And then I heard from people in the yoga community that it was everything that they were about. And then I started getting letters from the Christian, from Catholic priests and Christian and Baptist ministers saying this totally expresses our philosophy. You must be Christians, obviously, because it's such a devoutly Christian movie. And then the psychiatric community chimed in and said, obviously the movie is a metaphor for psychoanalysis because we revisit the same stories over and over. We keep reliving these same patterns in our life, and the whole goal of psychoanalysis is to break those pattern behaviors. So I thought, well, that's an ecumenical response to this film. It's got something.
So that. You can see where inevitably every time something is going out into the world, different people of different faiths or different backgrounds and different belief systems are embracing these things in different ways. So the reader's interpretation. So it is very much about this loop, and that's one of the things we're trying to explore in this exhibit is the interconnectivity of all of these things and how people think about the world. Inevitably, writers are influenced by their own belief systems or by those around them. They, in turn, are affecting the people who read their work or see their work or listen to their work. And then there's a feedback loop of how people are interpreting that work. For somebody my age, as a culture, we don't understand other people's belief systems very well when we're young. So when I was maybe in high school is probably when I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and that would have been my first exposure to Islam. And that is a book very much about his journey toward the Nation of Islam and then to Islam at a larger level on a worldwide basis. And, that opened up my eyes to different belief systems. And so that is very much how these things happen. But they're in everything. They're not just in books that are about religion. They're in movies like Groundhog Day. They're in stand-up specials. And as I mentioned, we get a lot of people who are exploring the issues of the movement maybe away from or struggling with their belief systems, and we look at people who are antithetical to or who are trying to look at the world without those systems. So an example would be in the comedy section, Patton Oswalt talks about comedy in the interactive and talks about religion in the interactive about comedy, and his feelings about being an atheist and how he looks at the world and what he thinks of religion, not in a negative sense per se, because he's very much saying that he's not against religion. He sees it as a construct for people to understand the world around them. He just has problems with people seeing it as a literal idea. So he looks at himself on a spectrum of how people who are non-believers interact with the world. He said, I'm not a Dawkins over here. I'm more of, here, not believing in these things, but being respectful of if those things make sense and if people aren't trying to make me think that way. We also find other humanists who are a big part of this, and we have a interactive within that I mentioned that's about science fiction and other worlds, speculative fiction. An example, of course, is Gene Roddenberry and the notion of Star Trek. And this is a very interesting one because Roddenberry himself was a humanist. He had been raised by in the Baptist church. His mother was very religious, but at a young age, he started to recognize that it didn't make sense to him. And so he eventually moved away from that. He won an award as being a humanist, I think in 1991. But, as a quote in the piece about him, he says, I guess from time to time it was clear to me that religion was largely nonsense, largely magical, superstitious things. In my own teen life, I just couldn't see any point in adopting something based on magic, which was obviously phony and superstitious. So he took that mindset very early on. So when we think about Star Trek, the original series, we think about the notion that it is very much pulled away from the idea of religion. He's created a world where there may be some religious history, but we run into it not with the people on the ship, but we run into it into the cultures they run into. So he's bumping into it in the original series. But even then, television, film, obviously are often influenced by more than a singular writer. And for that example, we get Spock holding this up. We all know Live Long and Prosper, right? Not a lot of people know, but a lot of people do as well, that, Leonard Nimoy was Jewish, and he stole that salute from, and I'm going to say it wrong, I think it's called the Shekinah blessing, which was given by Jewish priests that he observed once in an Orthodox synagogue. So when they were looking for something on set for salute, he made this up. And he made it up based on something he had seen in his own background. So even as Roddenberry might be going one way, the actors and other people who are influencing the show are going another way. And then that show famously went on, and there are multiple versions, and eventually religion becomes very important in some of them as different writers and different people take over. So they had a show called Deep Space Nine, which was set on a space station. And that one had a hugely religious overtone, with one of the characters being a prophet, and a whole bunch of other things that were not part of Roddenberry's type of world. So as a writer, he created a space that was based on his humanist ideas, and a lot of that still makes it into the shows as they go on, but other people come in, other writers, and so it continually is influenced by all these different perspectives. And I'll point out another famous writer that we all think about, especially if we're talking about humanism, and that, of course, would be Vonnegut. He is also featured in a couple of spots in this exhibit. And the one spot is obviously with Cat's Cradle. And Cat's Cradle, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is very much about the idea of looking at religion as something that is a lie, but is a lie of comfort. And the idea of the Cat's Cradle being that this children's game that people can play allows you to either see a cat in the cradle in the string, or to just see a loose mess of string, depending on how you want to live with and adjust to those things. And of course, his background, his family was very much free thinkers. His great-grandfather founded the Free Thinkers Society of Indianapolis. He was named honorary president of the American Humanist Association in 1992. In his novel Timequake, or his autobiographical novel Timequake, he said, "Humanists try to behave decently and honorably without any expectation of rewards or punishment in the afterlife. The creator of the universe has been to us unknowable so far. We serve as well as we can in the highest abstraction of which we have some understanding, which is our community." Which inevitably is the cornerstone of so many of these different religious beliefs, is it does come back to community and how people understand the world, and writers are people who show us that. We also have a book of his that's tied to one of the last artifacts that people will bump into, which is the typewriter that physically belonged to Jack Kevorkian. So, on a very interesting note, Jack Kevorkian was also raised in a very religious household, but became someone who moved away from those religious beliefs personally, and is most famous for being Dr. Death, of course, if you're not familiar. But he created a methodology to help people end their lives, hopefully painlessly, who were struggling with end-of-life issues. And that, of course, wound him up in jail, because when he brought these ideas forward, this whole notion was something that was very antithetical to many religious beliefs, to many community beliefs. And so the question was, is this murder, is assisted suicide? And he went to jail for that. And so we actually have his typewriter and a letter that he wrote on that typewriter to a prisoner who was exploring these concepts. And with that, we keep a copy of Kurt Vonnegut's book, God Bless You, Dr. Kevorkian, which is a very odd Kurt Vonnegut book where he talks to the dead by having Dr. Kevorkian make him dead briefly and bring him back to life, and so that he can go talk to these famous people. So, that's pretty much what this exhibit's about. We hope it's something that everyone finds engaging. We hope it's something that anyone can interact with and feel like they've learned something new. And that people recognize the power that writers have on our history and our culture, especially in this field. So thanks for having me.
Excellent, very stimulating, lots of material. And so we are going to have an opportunity for a question and answer session in a few minutes. Before we do that, we ask you to contribute what you can to the society. We're going to have a brief musical interlude. We'll pass a basket around if you still use cash. And you can give us money through our website. And I don't have the link. We take Zelle and other avenues as well. And so please give generously. We'll be back in a moment. Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask Carey Cranston to come back to the podium, and if you have questions for him about anything, please step over to the microphone that's here on my left and ask questions. Try to keep them to be questions so that everyone can get an opportunity to ask their questions. So come on up to the podium. Close
Hey,
that.
oh,
Oh.
Is this on? Are you thanks so much for being here. Thanks for what you do.
Sure.
This is possibly a really left field thing, and you can just say, okay. I'm trying, my mind somehow, something you said triggered me to think a little bit about the Chautauqua movement. I don't know if that's something you're familiar with in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. I'm very Midwestern, and it was very much the same kind of idea of what, it's a different, obviously, but the idea of creating a space and community for people who want to think about ideas through writing and talking about the writing and things like that. And I'm just curious if you imagine, in addition to your museum, what are other places besides independent bookstore, writers' talks or something? What are spaces where people who aren't here today and who aren't coming to your museum, where are those conversations and those connections being made in the modern era? And I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I think it does. I mean, it is, and then when you say the modern era, that's, I think, the challenge that a lot of us face is that there is a lot less gathering of human bodies together in spaces where they can have conversations on these topics. And, we have to both recognize and embrace that. So the question becomes, are those spaces something online? Are those spaces something within context and subsets of social media? Are they in Reddit? Are they, on X? Are they on, not Facebook, I doubt. But there are so many other ways that people are connecting, but I think that inevitably people need human interaction to have an in-depth conversation of any part. So there may be a changing of ideas. And if we remember, when we go way back, and Jane and John Adams are good examples of this because we have so many copies. But, we forget how important letter writing was between people. So when we talk about, people are online just trading things back and forth, people were trading gigantic conversations of ideas through written letters too. We just don't have to write letters anymore. But the idea that first we write our idea and then send it to people, and then they write and send back to us, is actually more complex than a conversation sometimes. So the spaces in which we will or do have these things now that are different from then, I think are continually going to shift, and we do have to look at them as both virtual and online types of things, and look for places where we can encourage that to happen. Does that help? I don't have a specific for you.
Yeah, I just think the challenge is, and it's always been true, it's true then and it's true now, is the self-selection of who's in which space.
Yeah.
And how do we cross spaces eventually, right?
Right.
Because eventually we're all in our own little worlds where we're happy and hearing things that make us know we're so smart.
And yes, and I agree that the self-selection is a tricky part. How many people can I get to come into an American Writers Museum? A man from I forget which state he was from, Kansas or something, was there, and I happened to be in the museum, and I chatted with him, and he was saying how much he loved the museum, and he's a writer, and he thinks this is phenomenal. And he said, "I'm here to see my daughter," and he jokingly said, "I asked my wife to come, but she said I could not think of anything more boring in the world." And I listened to him call and leave her a voice message saying, "You missed the best thing ever, blah, blah, blah." So I felt pretty good about that. But, inevitably how people self-select and look at things, it's really hard. That is why our educational programming is so important to us, because if we can inspire an interest in writing and an interest in reading in younger people, then we maintain the notion that people will get that notion of what's different from them and read things that aren't their life and cross boundaries.
Thank you very much for coming. I had no idea. I worked downtown for a long time and would walk up Michigan Avenue all the time. I had no idea that you were there. So we'll definitely plan to attend and bring it up with my son's school, for example. I'm sure they'd love to go. I don't have so much a question as an anecdote. I thought you might enjoy this. Yeah. When I was in my 20s, I attended a lot of figure drawing workshops where you, specifically at this studio on, I think, Belmont and Diversey somewhere. And it was this crazy guy who was like clearly a hippie and owned this old bungalow and would just use his house as the figure drawing studio. So he'd have nude models come up. And he had a ton of art around his walls. And there was one picture there, and it's relevant to what you said at the end of your talk. It was a picture of Dr. Kevorkian with this man's daughter when she was 4 years old. And they're standing together in a studio, and he's leaning down and he's talking to her, and the caption is, I can't remember the man's daughter's name, but it was something like Anne. It was like Anne and Dr. Kevorkian discussing art in a world without God. And it was like, wow, very profound to what you're talking about here and very intersectional with your topic. But anyways, that just an anecdote. I always have never forgotten that picture.
Yeah, I love it. And that, we love finding things like that. So when you dig into some of the content, we're always trying to look for the thing that maybe you haven't seen before or thought about in relationship to that writer. So I love that.
Hi, thank you for, that was loud. Thank you for being here. I'm thinking about the concept of, so writers have their religious backgrounds or whatever is shaping their writing, and then the readers are interacting with that writing with their own backgrounds. And that got me thinking about, do writers ever get frustrated when people are interpreting it differently than they intended it? I mean, it seems like that's a lot of it's really brave to put your ideas out there with the idea that it might not be interpreted the way you were expecting. I just don't know if you know so many writers, is that a thing they talk about?
Yeah, a lot of different people have talked about it in the sense of, and I think sometimes it happens. I'm thinking specifically, I think of the gentleman, I've forgotten his name, who wrote the book Fight Club and then was made into a film. He was very much creating a story that was antithetical to that mindset. He was satirizing it. He was putting it out there as something that showed the flaws in that toxic masculinity. And then that masculinity and the notions of those characters were embraced by a number of people. Obviously, Taxi Driver is another horrible example of someone embracing in the wrong way. And so it does definitely happen to writers where something they write gets interpreted very differently from what they hope it will be interpreted. And it's a struggle because then they have to then say, well, what do I write next? How do I approach this and get what I want? But at the same time, we can never forget that that's part of writing, is that it's a communal process. People think it's a singular process. I write, you read, you know what I read or what I meant. But people interpret things very differently all the time, and sometimes it's for the better or for a more interesting and broader conversation. So I think most writers want to see how people are going to react. And a lot of times it's surprise. It's also, oh, I didn't see that about my own work. And then somehow it's embraced. So does it have negative happenings sometimes? Yes. A lot of times I think it's far more interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for speaking. That
Sure.
was really cool. So a science fiction writer who started a religion, L. Ron Hubbard.
Yes.
Is he an exhibit or
Yeah,
is he?
he's in that science fiction section.
Okay.
We mentioned Dianetics. It is it's an American religion with millions of followers.
That's what I mean. It's like a touchy one. So it's
And yes, he used science fiction specifically as a means through the books of Battlefield Earth and others to draw people into a religion that he was building and setting up. We look at Mormonism, we look at all kinds of faiths within the context of this, and that is a given faith. So we do discuss it in that same thing where Kurt Vonnegut is. So they're right next to each other.
Okay, cool. And then another one. So you say science fiction, but you didn't really mention fantasy at all.
Well, I was kind of saying
or
speculative.
Are those folded in together, or how do
No,
you guys?
we roll it together as speculative fiction as a broader category of things that look at the world or worlds that are different than ours. And so one fantasy writer we have an artifact from and who we talk about, Ursula K. Le Guin, famously wrote the Earthsea trilogy. She also translated Tao Te Ching, so we have a copy of the original manuscript that she was translating from.
It's just like a lot of fantasy guys create their entire mythologies, and
Yes.
it's like that plays in with like real mythologies, or
Right,
you know, like,
and so we do talk about a couple of them as well.
okay, cool. No, it sounds like a really cool place. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks much. You've given me
Yeah.
a lot to think about. And I'm not sure if this is a question or a request. Draft pages typed out by famous authors that are then more corrections than they are original types. I think that'd be a great inspiration to novice writers when they see somebody famous making so much mistakes in their own stuff.
They do. We have a screen. It's by the typewriters. So when we opened, we had Jack Kerouac's original Scroll, if you know the story of the book On the Road, the Beat Generation, story. Jack Kerouac wrote that on teletype paper. He didn't want to stop in the first draft. He was on drugs, but he wanted to write straight through, and so he got teletype paper, and those sheets are 15 feet long. They're tissue-like, and he loaded them into a manual typewriter, and he typed without paragraph breaks, without anything, and he wrote the first draft of the novel. And so that he then 8 of those sheets he taped together, and then went through and did his pencil edits. So we have a screen where you can see that and zoom through it. And zoom in and look at where he changed words, and it highlights some of the things that were changed from the first draft to the second. We also do work with the Library of Congress on some of our online educational pieces, where we pull from their vast archives of digital resources and create classroom components for them, and a lot of that is looking at drafts, so that students see how various writers went through their drafting process wherever we can. So we don't collect things like that, but we do engage in that topic a lot.
I'll ask a question relevant maybe to some of our younger audience members. Today, a lot of the writing that younger Americans are experiencing is writing through different mediums in the novel, specifically video games, which can include a great deal of effort into writing or very little, and players notice. Has the Writers Museum explored writing in that medium?
Yeah, we just, I mentioned it earlier. Our last special exhibit before this was called Level Up, Writers and Gamers. And we specifically looked at the people who write the stories in narrative-based games. From Dungeons and Dragons, we kind of started with that era, and we looked at both electronic and role-playing games and talked about the significance of it, the processes that go into it. We worked with experts in the field across the city and the country who gave us advice about what's the important factors in that. And it's become a very interesting topic, because one of the reasons we were looking at it is we had a graph that was up in the exhibit that showed in 2022, I want to say, there was a big circle that showed gaming as an industry, and that was $200 billion. And then you put a circle in there for Hollywood, and it's $25 billion, and a circle in there for publishing, and a circle in there for something like the recording industry. And you take those 3 circles, and they don't even meet half of that video gaming. And the reason is, in the modern era, storytelling for a lot of people is, just as you said, that. So that was why we were approaching that topic, and through that special exhibit, and we have content on it still online. And we think it's incredibly important. And it's really interesting because now you have at major universities, at DePaul where I went, at IIT here in Chicago, you have whole gaming-based computer programming divisions. And within them, you now have writing for video games as a major within a college. So we actually had a student from IIT who was finishing his senior year do a project for us that we have not put online yet, but we hope to. It was tied to that exhibit, where he took Edgar Allan Poe works and used them as a theme to create a text-based video game, like the old Zork games, that you could wander through what was meant to be a delirious, insane person's mindset on a sinking airship. and a whole bunch of different things. So we think that that's very important, and we recognize that that is a way through which a lot of people get their content now. And it's interesting. There are great stories being told. There are huge stories that are then being adapted into books, television shows, things of that nature.
I wonder if in your thinking about future programming, you've considered the ways that American writers' books have been turned into American operas.
Oh.
I'm thinking, I'm a composer, and I worked with Karen Hess, who's a really important young adult author, to turn her book Witness into a 3-act opera. But the whole process of, how the book is revised to turn it into a libretto, and then because you're so into, videos and interactive things, these always have great videos of the operas, and just something, I don't know if it's on your roadmap at all.
It is. There is a general notion of an exhibit that we might be doing in the near future, and I don't like to make promises as we work through these. These processes often take a couple of years for us as a small institution, but it is on the idea of adaptation. And that notion of how something moves from a book to a play to a movie, or in this case an opera, or from a video game into a book and into a television show. So that notion of adaptation is really interesting and something that we want to explore in more detail. We have done programming around this at different areas and times. Obviously, we've had the opportunity with playwrights. We work sometimes with Chicago Shakespeare and with the Goodman and other theaters in Chicago, and we've had playwrights come and talk about how they were adapting an original work, and we had the librettist for, the Goodman did a musical version of the Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil 2 years ago. And so we had the original novelist for Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, and then the librettist who was then turning that into the musical. And we did the same thing for The Notebook. The Shakespeare premiered, they did a musical version of the book, The Notebook, which most people think of then the movie, but they were very clear it wasn't an adaptation of the movie, because that's always a tricky thing about rights. And adaptation. And that's something we talk to authors about all the time, because the company that bought the rights to make the movie still own those rights, but they don't own the rights to it being adapted for the stage. So the author is able to sell those rights to someone else. So they can't adapt the movie. The movie may have made changes from the book, but they are then adapting from the book straight to the theater. And that is often an issue of adaptation, as well as who owns which rights. I could go into a long story about Saul Zaentz and the Lord of the Rings, but I won't tell you that one right now, because it's not American writing, so it doesn't count. But that's a really interesting topic, and we are exploring it more. We've explored it a little bit. It may actually be an exhibit at some point.
Thank you.
So one of the questions yesterday on Wait, Don't Tell Me involved how the Pope was taking to tweets, wanting to tweet about the saints, but somehow that got mixed up with the New Orleans Saints. How does the museum approach tweets as a form of writing, and how do you see writers tweeting, or do they...
I mean, that's an interesting question right there, because Twitter was the home for writers in its heyday. When it transitioned to X and some of the changes that have gone on, a lot of writers have left Twitter itself because they have moral issues with the people who own it and how it's being run. But it was a huge home to writers, and there were amazing writers who were doing amazing things via tweet. There were people writing whole essays through tweets, especially when there was character limits. So they would write a tweet and respond to their own tweet and then build a whole chain through which they were writing. People were writing back and forth to each other. A lot of famous authors were using Twitter as a basis because they didn't have to worry about pictures. I mean, eventually they did, but early on, Twitter was the one that was focused on the word. So, no, we think it's a very interesting medium. As I mentioned before, letters are something that historically we think of. Social media is that means through which people communicate via words. So we think it's important.
So do some of your exhibits show tweets on screen?
I don't know if any of the, we have in special exhibits, I don't know that we have anything currently looking at any specific tweets or anything like that, but we engage with it on a programmatic level, and we obviously have our own social media that's engaging in that, and we try to promote other writers that are on social media and that type of thing.
Thank you so much for your talk. Has your museum explored how writers interface with AI or use AI in their writing?
We've done one program on that topic so far. I assume we will do more as time goes on. I believe I was not able to be there that night, and I keep meaning to watch the video. What we did was we had an AI expert, we had a science fiction writer, and we had ChatGPT as the panel. So we basically had a laptop set up, and the questions would be fed into ChatGPT, and we would see what the responses were, and then the other two were talking about the topic as well. So we have played around with that, and we will continue to address it as it moves forward.
You have me thinking about the interaction, the current environment for writers, and I have two, I think, related but different questions. One is the sort of more recent phenomenon of like fan fiction, some of which itself becomes almost as well known as the canon to which it was originally inspired, by which it was inspired. And the second thing is the more we know about writers off the page, and how that plays into how their work is received over time. And I'm thinking about, for example, a very famous best-selling author who has become known as transphobic and no longer admired by the children who grew up with her.
Yeah.
And phenomenon like that.
Okay. Well, they are kind of two different questions. On the first one about fan fiction, which is interesting, then we talk about writers losing fandoms and things like that. We think fan fiction is very interesting because, again, this is that response that we've talked about with some of these writers in the American Prophets exhibit. It's that notion that people pick up on something different from what the writer may have been intending, and build whole new worlds around it. We know that a lot of the fan fiction is often about romance and things that people want to take a certain direction, but a lot of it can just be people going in a different notion of they read the character one way and they want to see something happen. And so when we think about the history of literature and we say, okay, they're building or taking from someone else, well, that's what literature has always been about. It's not like Shakespeare's plots were original. Every one of them is based on either a history or a further back play that someone else wrote or a Greek tragedy. We're rewriting things all the time. So the idea of fan fiction, I think, is very common. It's the notion that people can get it out there for others to read, without mainstream publishing. And it's that change away from mainstream publishing being the only way for a book or something to be read by people, which actually opens up opportunities for new writers. There are a number of writers now who've come out of self-publishing who have become incredibly famous and powerful, and then suddenly are published in the mainstream world. So we've really changed the dynamic in how people can get their stories told. As far as the notion of knowing a lot more about writers, I think it's pretty interesting because some of it is the notion of the writer themselves and how much they want that. Because there are plenty of writers who are very good at not being known if they don't want that. I think writers tend to embrace or not embrace that, and the more someone embraces it, the more that the likelihood may occur that people learn more than they want to know about someone. And I think that that's an interesting conundrum, because I think that do we want our writers to be celebrities or not? And I think that's really up to them. I think it's how they want to embrace and engage with their readership and how they want to embrace and engage in the world. So they should be open to do whatever they want, but there has to be a recognition that inevitably the more you make yourself a part of the story that you wrote, the more likely it is that people are going to then read that into your work, and that may affect how people react to your work.
Thanks for your talk.
Sure.
Do you have favorite authors? Who are they? And do you have a literacy narrative of how you grew up and and became interested in whatever you're interested in because of literature?
I'll try and keep this brief because I think we got 2 minutes. I grew up in a very literary household. My parents, my dad was a milkman at one point and then sold pipe. My mom was a secretary, but they were both very heavy readers, and they both were part of an organization called the Chicago Heights Drama Group, which still exists today, which is a big community theater in the south suburbs. And so I grew up, from my earliest memories are of painting sets and doing other things. So the theater, writing, literature, those things were inherent in my family and what we did. So that inevitably led to my own interests in writing, and I read comic books, and I wanted to be a writer. And then I went and worked in a bookstore. I didn't go to college right away. I worked in a bookstore for a number of years, and that led to me meeting one of my hero writers. So you ask, a writer that I love is James Baldwin. And so I will tell you my James Baldwin story, which is I was 18 years old. I got a job at Crocs and Brentano's bookstore. If you're an old Chicagoan, you would know it was a giant bookstore here in Chicago. And we were the store. We were downtown on Wabash, and doesn't exist anymore. So, but people would come, writers all the time. I saw Sophia Loren. I saw all kinds of people because they'd come for signings. And one day we get a call out of the blue. And not me, I'm a stock clerk downstairs in the science and technical department. But they get a call upstairs that James Baldwin was in town for a radio interview, and he wanted to come by and sign some books. And at that time, he had an essay collection out and a short essay that had been turned into book form. And so there were 2 hardback books, and he was going to sign copies. And we were a bookstore with 15 branches, and we were the main stock site. So we had hundreds of books all the time, and we sent them out to our branches. So people would come sign stock. So he was coming to sign stock, and they needed somebody to chat with him while he was doing that. And they run around the store. Who wants to talk to James Baldwin? Now, I'm 19 at this point, and without a college degree, but I read a lot. And one of the people in the store had given me a copy of Another Country. And I thought the book was absolutely phenomenal and amazing, and I had never read anything like it. I was, a lot of comics and science fiction at the time, and a high school degree, but I was like, wow, this blew me away. And so I'm like, I'll meet him. And the woman who gave me the book was scared, because she was like, I don't want to meet him. I don't want to meet a hero and not like him. Back to your earlier question. So I didn't care, so I was like, I want to go meet the guy. And this is pre-internet, pre a lot of things. Again, it's the only book I've read of his at this point in my life. And I go upstairs, and they say, okay, he's coming. And I get to the front door with our store manager. And I don't know why our store manager didn't want to do this. The 19-year-old kid's going to do it. And he walks in, and I am expecting a man of 6'4", with an imposing voice, who is going, because the power of his writing has imbued in me this notion of a demigod. And in walks a man who is shorter than me, and very faint, and with a very high voice, who shakes my hand and is wearing a kind of purple velour jacket. But he was the sweetest guy in the world. We stood around, I handed him books, he told me about Paris, he told me about some other things. I think we spent half an hour together. So inevitably, I then read all of James Baldwin, and so there's my favorite writer. Thank you, everybody.
Much appreciated, very interesting. Definitely visit the museum. Appreciate you sharing all of that information. That is it for this morning. Thank you. Let them say we all came today.